So age, aging, and growing old, social and cultural perspectives on late life is the title. Okay. All right. So the composition of societies worldwide is changing, or as it is said, graying. And the issue for gerontologists and society more broadly is not only that there are more older people, but the terrain of what's considered old itself is shifting, as are the social and cultural conditions of what we might call growing old. So one example is that can you see the, yeah, kind of, okay.
It's a very absurd setup in this room.
Is it?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's okay though.
Okay, I'll go on this side. That's a little bit better. Okay, so thank you. I was like, uh-oh, it's going badly. Okay, so one example of this is how the once accepted age of 65, that's based on eligibility for public pensions, is changing, right? So as aging, and in the cases of age, as eligibility for various programs are debated and changing, then what is considered old within social institutions, policies and more generally, is shifting. So this can be, you can see age moving into older groupings, but also into younger groupings, 55 plus. And that'll become clearer as we go along through the talk, and why that matters, right? Why that matters to social gerontologists and cultural gerontologists. So once we add to this the ways that medical, scientific, and technological advances can alter the process of aging, that complicates it further. New technologies and medical interventions have changed the conditions of aging. Adaptive equipment and surgeries that impact age-related impairments alter the processes of aging, and in doing so, modify the meanings of growing old. So at the level, if we move down to the level of individual experience, what we see is that even older people's lifestyles and communities are reshaping aging, and they're being reshaped by aging through purpose-built leisure communities, through new success-based definitions of aging, through new aging identities. We hear older people, for example, claim that despite their age, they don't feel old, right? They feel the same age as they did at 30. So these shifting conditions of age, the processes of aging and meanings of growing old, provide a rich terrain to understand aging from a social-cultural perspective. So today's paper opens the 2013-2014 seminar series with a view from the social sciences, or what's more often referred to as social gerontology. Or, I suppose, and this is where it gets complicated, I'll use throughout the paper socio-cultural perspectives to the study of aging. And so there are distinctions between those that I'll try to make clear by providing some examples of my own work. Today's presentation, in the seminar series, we'll have a chance to go over that in the talk afterward, but we have 6 speakers from within McMaster, from across the disciplines. I realize it's a little bit small to read there, sorry. Okay. Today's presentation outlines, by example, what it means to take a social cultural perspective and reflects on the challenges that are brought about by contemporary aging. I'll argue for the importance of a social perspective and extend this into a call for interdisciplinary work that's capable of addressing contemporary issues. So my agenda for today's talk is first to set the context with a brief commentary on social gerontology and social cultural perspectives. Second, to distinguish between concepts of age, aging, and growing old that I've found helpful in approaching these differences. Third, to explore the areas of study from my own work that illustrate a social cultural perspective. And fourth, to reflect on some of the contributions made thus far and the need for ongoing collaboration that can help respond to contemporary issues. The theoretical focus, my work really focuses on these intersections between, or the relationships between social policy, practice, or practices, and lived experience. It's rooted in what's known as critical gerontology, and perhaps more recently cultural gerontology, that questions taken for granted assumptions, social relations, cultural questions of aging, and the biographies or accounts of older people themselves. At a base level, it argues that older people are entitled to a good quality of life, and that the experiences of old age are determined as much by economic, social, and cultural factors as they are by individual characteristics. A little bit about critical gerontology. It emerged in the 1980s, 1990s, and it was a challenge to traditional theories or dominant perspectives on aging. Approaches in critical gerontology, though, can be seen to differ between countries and between disciplines. So what we're talking about is not always, it's not the same kind of idea of critical gerontology. It depends who you're speaking with. For example, in the UK, the tradition's primarily rooted in the social sciences, and in the US, it's more connected to the humanities, and there they tend to refer it as aging studies or age studies. Key components of critical gerontology focus on critical reflection, understanding and analyzing structure and social change, and this perspective has primarily been used to address the social construction of dependency, for example, the dominance of the medical model, and social structures and economic relationships that have created and sustained financial impoverishment of older people. Now that's kind of the roots of critical gerontology, or where it started. More recently, critical gerontology has broadened into critical perspectives that also focus on diversity, lifestyles, and culture more broadly. The field has responded to larger trends in social sciences theories over time, this kind of cultural term, and now takes a greater account of the changing social and cultural context within which aging takes place. So I'm particularly interested in the tensions and contradictions within powerful everyday concepts, notions, and locations, and for us to help understand and approach contemporary issues of aging. When we're talking about interdisciplinary work, my work is really drawing on it from a number of perspectives and theories, including social constructionism, discourse analysis, micro-sociology of organizational practices, political economy, feminism, psychodynamic perspectives, and cultural studies. So this is complicated, right? And although drawing on these divergent perspectives raises huge theoretical issues, which are the subject of a different paper, that's lucky for me, because then I don't have to address them today, right? The focus today is really to highlight how some of these interdisciplinary perspectives or interdisciplinary lens can really provide a better pathway to understanding aging in late life. So I'm not going to deal with those at the moment, but maybe we can do so in the question period if you have some inquiries there. So I wanted to just pause for a moment over social gerontology and socio-cultural perspectives, just to make sure that we're on the same page for those of you who might be coming from across the university in different disciplines. So basically, gerontology, we're talking about a field that was coined in 1903 as a multidisciplinary field. As outlined by Eichenbaum in 1989, it's broadly the study of aging from biological, psychological, and social perspectives, or what is known as the scientific study of aging. I think that in itself is interesting. As the field developed, we saw further distinctions being made between geriatrics, for example, that was coined in 1909, which was a hospital-based specialty, and treatment of persons through medicine or allied health professionals, and in those kind of distinctions, social gerontology became the name used broadly to describe social studies of aging. So there we're referring to social, economic, demographic characteristics of older people and an aging population. And I think we could argue that we could now add culture to that list, although it didn't necessarily appear in the development. So what's important to retain for today is that while social gerontology seems, just on saying it, as a united field, right, it seems like one type of approach, it's actually, by nature, an interdisciplinary approach, and it's drawing on several different disciplinary perspectives: sociology, anthropology, political science, geography, and more recently, cultural studies. It also has this complicated relationship because it includes practices and practitioners from, let's say, social work, nursing, community development. So what we mean by social gerontology is itself complex. If we look more closely at this, at social gerontology, we find that there are not only these disciplinary perspectives, but also, and professional divisions, but also you see vast differences in the types of approach that are taken. So, for example, you can see traditional approaches that focus on integration of older people in society. Now, some of those that you could argue are outdated, but they're actually still being used in when we start to examine social policies, this idea that older people need to integrate and be a part of larger society. Obviously, what's behind that is that they're somehow not, right? So, interrogating that. Humanistic approaches focused on meaning, and as outlined earlier, critical approaches that focus on economic, social, political, and now cultural contexts. So the work that I'm describing today is really situated in this social and critical gerontology. And what's interesting to me about that is that it's very much a reflection of my generational stance. So as a scholar of my generation, I'm able to draw on these strands or these traditions that scholars older than myself weren't able to, because they had a marked tradition of kind of structural approaches to aging rooted in political economy and or in the humanistic. But coming along, these were being developed, as I was working on my master's PhD, and you can see that in the work of students now that actually automatically draw on the two as well. And I think that's something significant for the field, that we can merge those. And I suppose for those reasons, that's why I refer to what I'm talking about as a social-cultural perspective to the study of aging, because it does integrate the two. Now, the literature doesn't always look like that. So when you speak with people of a particular generation and students, there's an assumption that that's the practice, that's the way the field looks, and it's actually, the literature hasn't caught up to that yet, is what I'm saying, I suppose. So I would refer those of you looking for more information on the development of the discipline to Eichenbaum or to Stephen Katz. Just to kind of note some of the works that are known for the humanistic turn or humanistic studies or cultural turn in gerontology are those of Cole and Gatto. They ask the question, what does it mean to grow old in Western society? You also had works such as Images of Aging, Featherstone and Hepworth, or The Cultures of Aging, which is Gilliard and Higgs. So you can see that there's the critical tradition and the cultural that I would merge under social cultural. We good there? I'll move on. Okay. So, Age, Aging, and Growing Old, which is the title of this presentation. I found the distinction between these terms very helpful in my attempt to link policy structures and discourses with the experiences of older people. Because again, the approaches methodologically tend to be separated. You either look at policy or you look at experiences. And so I've been trying, with some critique, and I think that's helpful, so I'm open to that. I've been trying to figure out how do you actually merge these two in some ways. And I felt that these terms, although they're sometimes used interchangeably, there are important distinctions between them that I found helpful. First, age. Age is a concept that refers to chronological age, and that's marked by the birthday. So as long critiqued by the way, while taken for granted in practices such as research, right, where we just say it's this age, our sample comes from this age, or in health and social care practices, the notion of age itself is constructed and is problematic where we think of practices of ageism, right, or social practices that I'll get into around frailty are concerned. So while there's no one accepted definition of age, the way that age is used in social context is of note. So this can range from a static use in eligibility for services, so 65 plus, for example, to a more flexible use in the personal definitions of aging. So that idea that I don't feel old, right? I'm not old. Personal biographical. Second, aging. Aging is a concept that refers to a process of aging over time, birth to death. So the emphasis on process and change over time has been helpful in the study of transitions, as I'll demonstrate. In the contemporary context, the social and cultural context within which one ages is both structured by age and stage-based transitions that shape social cultural meanings and lived according to personal experiences and interactions with those systems and practices. So understanding the trajectories of age as a lifelong process can shed light on the expected models of and ways that older people are expected to grow old, right? And the ways that their accounts may differ or correspond with those expectations. Excuse me. Third, growing old is a concept that refers more to the meanings and interpretive dimensions of aging. So the, the lived experiences as one moves across the life course. How do older people experience aging in life? What accounts do they give? How do they negotiate their lives and experiences? So together these nuances can focus on the distinction between what's taken for granted in relation to age, which is that idea of chronological age, the social and cultural processes of aging, what happens over time, and the lived experiences of older people themselves. As such, they allow for a method of moving between the macro and the policies and practices and the personal accounts. Now, I'd like to, this is maybe atypical in a presentation, and I'm not sure how it works, but we'll see. What I'd like to do is give 3 different research illustrations to try to outline what this social cultural perspective is. While rooted in very different subject matter, what they share is a concern for taken for granted notions that can guide expectations and experiences of aging in late life. We could liken this exploration of the three projects as peering through a different window to get a better glimpse of experiences of aging in late life, and in particular, the challenges of the divisions that are made between health and illness. So in the first, we explore frailty, a popular term used to determine eligibility for services that has taken on importance as a socio-cultural construct. In the second, we consider transitions across the life course and into late life, and the ways in which dominant approaches shape or structure late life. In the third, we examine the particular location of homelessness and aging that challenges some of the more popular notions of age that are framed around place, health, and privilege. Frailty. In 2007 and later in 2009, I argued that the concept of frailty that's used as eligibility criteria in home care is itself a social construct. So this construct draws attention to the problems of age-based planning and the social implications of depicting older people as ill or in decline. Further, it demonstrates the potential problems that can result where public commitment to resource allocation and social programs for frail seniors are concerned. As most of you know, I think, frailty has received growing attention within the biological sciences and social planning over the last 15 years. The assessment of frailty, just to give you a concrete manifestation, is according to functional criteria of mobility, falling, weaknesses. And this has become the dominant way to assess risk, and as a result, the primary means to ration health and social care services. So in clinical or medical, and even home care practices, what you see is older people's bodies and their health status, because they're assessed, their function and their mobility is measured. And these indicators are all tallied to provide a standard measure of risk and frailty. The result is that older people are then placed in this binary where they're either eligible for services or they're not. And I think what's even more interesting is in that eligible services eligibility, you can see that there's something further that's happening too, where they're either able to benefit from programs or they're considered beyond repair. Okay, and I think that's something that we hold on to as significant. It's here, with the increased prevalence of using frailty in research and practice over the years, that frailty has taken on this status as a social construct. That is, in addition to marking eligibility for services, frailty marks a symbolic distinction between health and illness, a distinction known as the fourth age. As such, frailty plays an important role in structuring relationships within and between older people in society and across generations, and this is especially where practices or younger, more healthy seniors are concerned. My interviews with older women around meanings of frailty and an investigation of how this concept is used in practice demonstrates that frailty is not only a benign classification used in medical and social practices, but as a social construct imbued with meanings that are commonly associated with dependency and decline. As a result, frailty holds emotional conflicts for individuals, loss over the years, for example, and may hold serious consequences for social relationships between the generations. How, for example, might our fears and anxieties about frailty and the end of life inform the responses and decisions that are made about older people, the value of care and the services provided to them? How are frail older people marginalized in society, and what does this mean in terms of solidarity within and across generations? So in sum, frailty represents a social construct that structures and shapes social relations based on functional assessments of the aging body, establishes an increasing divide between older people who are healthy and older people who are frail, and produces social divisions based on the intersections of age and illness. And it's these relationships that can produce disturbing emotional relationships toward frail older people with failing bodies. Illustration 2, transitions. In 2005, I launched a study into major transitions that were considered to set boundaries and expectations for aging in late life. And these are later published in a book on transitions. So in this study, I was concerned with identifying standard models that existed as frameworks for aging and the ways in which these may or may not fit with older people's lives and experiences. The research project turned to policy discourses and older people's lived experiences as a way to understand these suggested frameworks for late life. This required understanding the various models by which life experience was considered to be organized, followed by a review of the models suggested by policy, and finally a comparison with the narratives of older people at diverse social locations. I won't get into this chart, but it's some of the dominant expectations that exist. What you can kind of see how they're age and stage-based segregated. So an area that emerged from the study related to my previous example of frailty was this polarization of health and illness in social-cultural expectations, policies, and practice. But this was overlooked as a major transition. So if you look at this chart, it's basically this kind of transition between all the way across the life course and then this abrupt kind of change to that fourth age or to illness and decline that we're talking about. A review of policies led to the finding that policy documents themselves were polarized. The majority of guidance and policies on aging, macro-level documents, especially on an international level, were focused on healthy aging, or what was considered the third age. With the exception of messages of preventing decline, the realities of decline, impairment, and/or death were overlooked. Only service-level policy documents dealt with the fourth age, and most of this focused on assessing risk for the purpose of distributing services. Yet, despite being overlooked on this policy level, this transition was significant for older people themselves. So what does this mean with regards to the broader study of aging in late life? In part, it demonstrates the extent to which the suggested models for growing old tend to be positive in nature, and as a result, overlook realities that can occur: chronic illness, onset of impairment, mobility, and so forth. This leaves the experiences of older people who are occupying such locations with no general models by which to age well. Impairment and/or illness, chronic or episodic, become socially and culturally separated from this idea of aging well. This opens a space for negative assumptions that those with illness or impairment are somehow to blame, and that their locations are, in a sense, by default, examples of not aging well. This may lead to practices whereby older people with impairments may be excluded as a default. And this is a topic that one of my doctoral students explored in looking at the experience of people aging with disabilities and how their relationships to policies such as participation ended up putting them on the outside. They were excluded from senior spaces, as an example. But how did older people speak about this polarization? Did it exist? Older people's accounts were extremely complex in this regard. They reproduced the polarization, as we might expect, and they also spoke about the challenges that polarization raised for them on a personal level. The social and cultural implications of this polarization became clear in their accounts. Older people discussed in real life how these categories weren't fixed. This frailty, this fourth age, wasn't fixed. They gave examples of how across the life course they had moved in and out of illness, for example. Yet, at the same time, they recognized that some of these changes at one point became more permanent in nature. And there was a threshold at some point which they could not return to their previous state. They discussed the significance that illness or impairment had in their lives, especially when it meant that they became excluded from their social groups, their friendships, and so forth. Several examples were given about friends who became ill and/or how they themselves moved into this space of liminality, just kind of existing between that third and fourth age, or fourth age and dying. So in a case where older people felt that they'd crossed that threshold, they spoke of the significance and how that actually should be recognized as a transition and met within services or met within their encounters with healthcare professionals and social care professionals. So the power of this fourth age construct became evident in social policies and in older people's accounts, highlighting the liminality that older people experienced in being located in between what was more commonly polarized as health and illness. It also demonstrates the challenge in achieving successful models, empowerment, and aging, and led to a chapter with a colleague of mine, Chris Phillipson, where we argued that the concept of agency has to be adapted for the agency in the fourth age. That agency in the fourth age might look different. It might not be as active. It might not be as verbal, as kind of voiced. It may more be through expressions. It may more be through practices that we don't recognize. We can get into some of that later. So it may look different than across the life course. An example that comes up is in dementia. How then do you recognize? Example 3 is homelessness and aging. So my concern for homelessness and aging, which is my current research project, came from being troubled by particular locations of aging that did not seem to fit with any of the expected models or frameworks. Homelessness is a social, economic, and political issue. As such, it resonates with the roots of critical gerontology in terms of concerns for social structures and economic disadvantage. But it's also important where questions of the culture of aging and interpretation of meaning are concerned. Homelessness in late life falls outside of the standard and new suggested frameworks for aging. But what happens at the intersections of aging and homelessness? How is this similar or different from what we know about homelessness and what we know about aging? The issue of homelessness in late life tends to be invisible within current discourses and practices on aging, except those who work in shelters or hospitals that report that the issue is really on the rise. So I'd like us to consider two of the most popular frameworks for aging, just to kind of think about these contradictions. The first is aging in place. So one popular framework is that of aging in place, which is built around the idea that older people want to grow old at home and in their communities. Aging in place has been adopted as a framework by the WHO and has spurred an age-friendly cities initiative to make cities and communities more age-friendly. But homelessness is a placeless sort of aging. I think that's the contradiction. Second, healthy and productive aging. Other popular frameworks are those of well, healthy, and productive aging that have been referred to as these new models of aging. In these new success-based models, health and well-being are posited as the models for aging in late life. While most would agree that health is better than sickness, right, as a model, the problem is with the primacy that these models have had in setting the rules for aging, right, and for the ways in which this can overlook some of the realities facing particular individuals and groups. So here I'm speaking of the examples like illness, injury, impairment, or, in this case, marginalization and disadvantage that threaten these locations of wellness. Frailty, the fourth age, and homelessness are all such locations. Homelessness in late life confronts both the comfortable notion of aging in place and the models based on health and wellness. Homelessness draws attention to the contradiction underlying aging in place, the economic and social realities of not having stable housing. Homelessness in late life highlights the social issues that can occur across the life course and the ways in which they may impact late life. For example, the pathways of long-standing mental health issues, the implications of trauma or addiction, as well as extreme poverty, marginalization, and deprivation. Homelessness in late life confronts the well, healthy, and productive models for late life and points to the importance of addressing marginalization and deprivation across the life course, the traumatic turning points, as well as building more comprehensive models of lifelong health that are both physical and mental in nature. So although I don't have results to share with you at this point, we're exploring the intersections of aging and homelessness, the experiences that take place at those intersections, particularly in emergency shelter, housing, and long-term care, and the needs and realities of older homeless people. So bringing this together into interdisciplinarity and the contemporary context of aging, we can see that social and cultural gerontology have made contributions to, for example, looking at a literature broader than what I was presenting today, the historical understandings of aging, welfare systems, health policy, late life, lifestyles, and culture of aging or being old, to name a few. By means of examples from my own work, I've illustrated some of the ways in which social cultural perspectives that cross disciplinary boundaries can lead to a better understanding of aging in late life. The examples of frailty, transition, and homelessness have outlined practical ways that a critical review of the taken for granted language suggested for models for growing old and accompanying social practices can be matched with the experiences and narrative accounts of older people. Although I've provided only limited illustrations, I hope I've been able to outline what this social cultural perspective is, and more importantly, demonstrated the importance of addressing aging from a social and cultural perspective. But such understandings have only been possible by exploring sites where older people receive care, for example, and moving across disciplinary boundaries and the conceptual spaces of language, clinical practice, and interpretive meaning. And yet, while what has been achieved is predicated on an interdisciplinary platform, it has primarily been social in scope. However, each of these three studies of frailty, transitions, and homelessness contain potential for expansion beyond the social. For example, an economic perspective tracing trajectories into frailty, late life, and homelessness could hold explanatory potential. Likewise, an investigation that accounts for relationships with medicine, science, and technology in each of the three may help contextualize the cultural context within which these experiences are said to occur. So a study of chronic illness and health trajectories within each of these and the role of science, medicine, and technology could yield fresh insight. So in conclusion, social cultural perspectives on aging are an essential component of our inquiry into aging in late life. While the importance of these types of questions can sometimes be overlooked in a context where science and medicine prevail, or in political climates focused on fiscal constraint and productivity of all citizens, it is these very climates that make the investigation of the social and cultural issues of aging a more critical task. How do older people want to live their lives? What models can guide aging experiences, policies, and programs? What social responses best address the needs of older people in a contemporary context? As scholars, the question we face is how do we account for such rapidly changing societies, not only in terms of demographics, but of aging in a changed society where the guidelines for growing old are shifting, technology abounds, and age identities and lifestyles are negotiated and renegotiated. The contemporary context of aging and the emergent questions require approaches that are increasingly interdisciplinary in nature and cross scientific, political, and cultural boundaries. Questions of aging in late life are not only about the classifications of age, the processes and relationships involved, and the meanings, they're about the intersections of all of these. As a result, answering the contemporary questions of aging will require innovative approaches and studies that are capable of articulating the specific disciplinary issues that exist, right, and a detailed analysis of the issues at hand, such as those presented today as social-cultural, but also that reach across disciplinary boundaries in order to address the complexities of aging in the contemporary culture. It is in this vein that we've organized a seminar series on interdisciplinarity this year, and our seminar series draws on several perspectives across campus to highlight some of the work being done here at McMaster, to raise new questions, to stimulate opportunities for exchange. So I urge you to take part in these conversations to explore new relationships and thought-provoking questions that can ultimately help us to better understand age, aging, and growing old. So thank you for coming out today. Thank you to the donors of the center, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council have funded all of the projects. Thank you. So now I have to, are there any questions for place your roles here? So I wonder if I can open up the floor to questions, and maybe if you could introduce yourself as you ask questions for those of us who may not know each other. I'm ready. Thoughts?
So I'm Sian Koppel. I'm from Australia.
Welcome.
I think that presentation was wonderful, and I'm particularly interested in the concept of transition. So I'm an older driver researcher. So
Right.
we're interested in the balance between safe driving, but also mobility as well. So how do we balance that? And we know that when people have to make the decision about stopping driving, that there's a lot of negative health and psychosocial consequences about stopping driving. So people get depressed, they can't access community, they can't access medical treatment. So for us as researchers, we're really trying to work out where does that balance between safety and mobility. Yeah.
What's really interesting to me about what you're saying from a social cultural perspective is the way in which driving is independence, right? So it's that concept of independence that actually stopping driving, in most cases, someone has told them that they can't drive, whether it's family or medical professionals. But what that brings is it's that threshold of frailty, right? It's that threshold of the fourth age. Those are some of the examples where frailty or late life tends to take on that significance, right? And in some of the research, the accounts that I have, there are examples of older people using, sometimes, more often they use illness, but sometimes they use that losing their license or losing their mobility as that marker, right? Each of the stories had a marker, and it's there that I would agree with you. What's interesting is that you've actually been able to find the links between health, that it actually does have a poor outcome. That loss. So that's fascinating. Yeah. And how to do it, I mean, are there ways that you can actually make, I mean, in certain cities you can think of ways that driving, people don't necessarily drive, so then public transit, possibly making public transit more accessible, there's not that same delineation of independence or dependence, right?
But I guess our conflict too is if you take people out of the car and you make them pedestrians or public transport users, their frailty, is increased. So
exactly.
Yeah, again, we have that conflict.
Exactly. Yeah, and working on that, and that's that's maybe where some of the technology, the adaptation in technology comes in, but that doesn't speak to the symbolics of it, the significance, but it maybe speaks to that.
But really, I think it just pushes the threshold, to be perfectly honest, of the changes that are happening in the automobile. Now, I mean, we've seen 65, not the same 65, and I know we've all said that. But nonetheless,
even 75 is not the same.
it's not the same 75, whatever we
Right.
say. Yeah.
Right.
So
Thank you.
eventually, we will all have to give up our license, right?
Yeah.
And that can happen at any time along those lifespan, but we all know that's very hard, and how do we support that
Right.
transition?
Absolutely.
And just add to that, actually, I'm amazed at the resilience of us olders. There were three cases that I know of. One in particular, I had driven her until she was 83 and lost it tragically because her husband had a stroke, and it just circumstances she had to live with it because of her eyesight. But I can't get over, she takes those tickets that the city gives out. Like, I think that if there's those social helps, stay-in tickets,
I agree.
and she goes from her house to the nearest bus stop in that taxi, and then she gets her taxi, or her bus rather, and she might have to transfer. But she does that from the far south mountain in Hamilton. And I'm just amazed. I see her sometimes at Lime Ridge, and she's just taking the bus after years and years of driving. So.
Well, we say that people plan for retirement. They also need to plan for stopping driving. And so I guess the thing that we should be encouraging is people to use those facilities before they stop driving. So before their eyesight has failed, before they need a mobility scooter, so that they can get used to those processes, so that it's not so daunting when they do stop driving.
Which there are some great initiatives happening, right? Here in Hamilton, around, trying to encourage that, and some very proactive things that are happening, which is really exciting to try to help people with that transition. But I mean, the public, to pretend that taking the bus is the same as having your own car, we have to be very mindful of the messaging of that, because we know it's not. So I'm a volunteer driver in Dundas for seniors as well, and that door-through-door service is very different. So how do we support people, and what kind of messages does it give to them?
Yeah.
How do I take the bus now?
And actually, just to go back to some of the research on frailty with those accounts, it was only 12 older women, but the bus was actually articulated at one of the sites where they felt frail. So that's even more complicated, right? The policies or the kind of programs are saying, okay, now take the bus, but the bus is that location of frailty. So not only does it put them at risk, but they feel that the subjective feeling or the meaning on the bus is that they're not safe, right? That they're not comfortable. More so than in healthcare practices where they may resist that notion of frailty a bit more.
To some extent, I wonder, so as a volunteer driver for seniors, cars also have this very strong meaning of independence and individuality, right? Which is also lost when you are forced to use public transportation, right? And one of the things that's happening in field transportation that is very exciting is changing models for property rights. And there are several trends I think that will be very evident and more important in the next few years, that younger people are not taking licenses at the same rates as, you know, as the current old did, but also feel more comfortable sharing resources. So there is not that, you know, my car is like my girlfriend, right? That very strong emotional attachment to the private vehicle. And one of the things that's happening is car sharing, for instance, which provides a nice compromise between you know, public and private transportation. But that, you know, if you already went through driving cessation, it's not actually helping you a lot. So I'm wondering about you know, to what extent we'll be seeing variations on these ideas by introducing not only private, you know, volunteer drivers, which, by the way, I don't know how it is in Canada, but in the United States, they have huge liability issues. I mean, if you're driving voluntarily and you crash and kill you know, an old person, I mean, it's just, the legal framework for that is just terrible. But you know, services like, you know, an upgrade from car sharing, where you also get, you know, assistance that comes with the car, may be a way to go forward.
Yeah, and there are models as well too, aren't there, where someone, like, it's almost this assistance where someone agrees to kind of donate their car collectively, and also negotiates drivers. I have my own experiences with car sharing coming from Montreal, right? So that was kind of a more established way, I suppose, of moving around the city, car sharing. And the metros weren't necessarily accessible. So for older people, it did raise an issue. Exactly.
Just a question as to whether there's any work going on in the urban-rural situation. In other words, everything I'm hearing is urban.
Yeah, there is actually, and the rural context presents different challenges, especially where the loss of a license is concerned, because older people are so dependent on having to travel so far, especially to medical appointments and that sort of thing. So yes, there is some work on rural locations, and I think this is one of the main things that comes up: accessibility for services and transportation, where you don't have public infrastructure models. Now what you do have, though, is maybe smaller communities, and maybe, I mean, Margaret, you know some of the work on age-friendly cities and some of the smaller communities where they may see parishes, for example, taking on that role, or community organizations. I don't know if you can speak to any specific examples.
I don't know the rural stuff too well. I know that there's certainly a lot of concern about people growing older in rural environments where there aren't the services, and if they lose their license, they're not able to get out, and so how do they, you know, continue to participate in the community, and so there certainly needs to be a lot more research. And Canada has, and they are doing some initiatives that they are encouraging rural and remote communities to try to work to becoming more age-friendly, and they've got a guide now for rural and remote communities to help them organize to become more age-friendly. So, but I haven't seen too much of the results of that research coming out yet. Yeah.
And this is a place where, I mean, e-health is being introduced to remote communities, but does that, you know, so people may have access to a doctor through e-health, but they don't necessarily have physical means of mobility or moving across the city or across to visit relatives. So different issues. That's a good intersection with technology.
I have a question about, so Margaret Denton, Department of Aging and Society. So a question about how can we hear the voices of frail older adults, or you know, people in the fourth age? Because I mean, as researchers, we go out, we try to interview them. It's very, very hard to find them, get permission to do the interviews. So we're not really hearing their voices about what it's like, you know, to be frail, or how difficult it is to access services or family and friends, or know, what's important to them, how are they finding meaning in life, like, how do we hear those voices without having to?
Yeah. This, I mean, there are two pieces I think that are crucial there. The first is about, you're right, it's difficult to access people or populations because they're increasingly at home in their, and that speaks to the social marginalization, right? They're not getting out, they're living at home, not really, they're in their communities, but there's no relationship between. So I think some of that is through referrals. I've had some luck with doing that through medical practitioners, hospices, long-term care, but the other issue that comes up with that is that some of the people that you go to interview don't actually have much of a voice, if you know what I mean. So they can't actually articulate their experiences in the same way, and that raises methodological issues. And I guess that's what we were speaking of with that the paper on agency, and that agency might look different. There was a researcher in Quebec that started looking at the meanings of screams and cries and dementia and this sort of thing. And there's something in that that maybe tells, there's something in the gesturing or in that maybe that's agency, but it's not using verbal kind of patterns. So to do research, you see what I'm saying? So to do actually research on that, to say there's a voice, there is a voice, it's there's a communication, but what does that communication look like, and how do you interpret it, right? So there's a methodological challenge. But I think what is important in that is still trying to seek out those voices, right? Recognizing that those voices look different, sound different. Ethics boards sometimes are difficult to get around on that level.
So Mark?
Yes.
Hi, so John, I have one possible answer for when you're asking your question, how do we access this population of individuals who are in the fourth age or entering it? I found this fascinating. I'm a hospital-based internist. I work at Hamilton General Hospital. So my answer to your question, just come to our ward, and at least half of them, the patients I care for, are right where you're talking about, is either they're in that limbo between the third and fourth age, or they're losing, they're going through that experience of loss, or they're fully into a state of dependence. And certainly there are some of those individuals who won't have a typical voice because they are demented or they've lost their mental capacity. But there are many of them who are still able to interact and communicate. Of course, you're catching them at a clearly vulnerable, unstable time in their lives, but we've certainly done research in that population because I'm interested in end-of-life decision-making, trying to understand the preferences for care. So it's a very medical focus, what I'm looking at, but it is a pretty interesting group of people to study.
Just a question back to you. Do you, in your clinical practice, do you then change the practices once someone kind of crosses that threshold and they're not able to come into clinical appointments? How does the practice change, or is it not able to adapt?
Yeah, so I'm a hospital-based practitioner, so I actually am quite naive about what happens to my patients after they leave the hospital, which is a problem actually, because our system is generally pretty siloed. But I think it does have some implications. So there are some people who, because of their state of being more or less housebound, get lost to the system, and in fact can't get the kind of high-quality care that they need that would stop them coming back and forth to the hospital with flare-ups or whatever chronic illness they have. And a lot of it is because of loss of independence. There's that happens. And then there's also a big, I think still quite a negative view around patients who are fully in the fourth age and they're in the hospital. They're kind of seen as a nuisance, like, oh, why are you here and taking up this hospital bed? You should be somewhere else. And there's a lot of that goes on.
That's what I meant with that group that's seen as kind of beyond repair, right? That significance, or the kind of devalue that's separated. It's too late, right, to do it.
Well, just a point about older people's voices in terms of research. I thought some of the problem with getting people's stories and conveying people's stories has not been so much a matter of access with qualitative research. It's been, I think, the problem with the paradigm itself, because, I mean, the social-cultural paradigm in terms of gerontology was quite far behind, say, that turn in sociology and even disciplines like geography. So what's happened, there's been a kind of rush to social theory. And so that meant there's a lot of drilling down to find the sort of core essences, identities, attachments, meanings, the underlying social processes. And sometimes in papers that's been the driving factor. So you read a lot and you learn more about Foucault than you learn about the older people's lives. So I like the fact that the critical paradigm now is turning to more non-representational paradigm, where we're trying to find out about the active world and the taking place of life for older people. It's getting back to performativity and bodily performance and things like that, and not so developed or framed always around social theory, but still critical nonetheless. That was just an observation I got. You look for a qualitative paper, and you're not finding the stories about people's, what's happening to people. That's my issue.
Yeah, and I think that issue of representation is key.
I'm Ellen Bedone from Anthropology and Religious Studies, and as an anthropologist, of course, I would like to put in a plug for the contribution that anthropology, cultural anthropology in particular, ethnographically based research can make to the cross-cultural understanding of well-being, and particularly to the individual stories of people's experiences.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that I didn't get into in this paper is that a lot of what became known, that the studies of transition in gerontology were really taken from anthropology. They were changed, and they were changed so that they became this, they kind of were fitted into this structural functional framework where older people had to be seen to integrate, but they actually came from anthropology and death studies and studies of ritual, and Van Knapp's work on liminality. Yeah. So actually the roots of studying transition and gerontology are very much anthropology. Yeah, and there's much, I agree, there's much more to be done there, but there aren't many anthropologists working in aging per se. I mean, or at least there are anthropologists who are working in anthropology, but they don't necessarily identify in social gerontology as anthropologists. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think there are certainly anthropologists working in the area of death and dying.
Yeah.
Whether they count as working on aging too is a little bit blurred.
It's a larger debate, isn't it? Yeah. It's interesting whether people identify with the field or not.
I'm thinking of Sharon Kaufman,
yes, exactly.
For example. And there is within the American Anthropological Association, there is a Society for Anthropology and Gerontology. So yes, I think there is that nexus of people, but perhaps we aren't engaging enough in cross-disciplinary dialogue.
Thank you.
That sort of might be related to something that anthropology and ethnographic methods could contribute to sort of hearing the voices, but I think one of the limitations of really hearing the voices of frail older adults is the methodologies we often use in gerontology or sociology, where maybe you do one interview with someone that lasts an hour and you have a set of questions you ask them, and if you're doing that with somebody with dementia, you might not get answers you can necessarily rely on, but if you do more of a long-term approach or an ethnographic approach, I think you can still gain a sense of what that person's life is like, that you might not be able to get out of those standard methods we use, but then there's the limitations to changing our methods because of funding and all sorts of other things.
Yeah, and I found that interesting to find when you're interviewing someone who has more mild cognitive impairment, to find the stories within the stories. So you have this extensive series of interviews that are quite long, and then you look in those and you can identify stories that they hold dear, right? Or those kind of typified stories within their own account.
Just one question, it might be redundant, but you mentioned in the beginning that the Americans have a humanities approach and the Canadians different. And I just wondered, is there a place at which they come to agree or teach one another from their different disciplines?
That's a good question. Could you introduce
Oh,
yourself to the group?
I'm Judy Bailey, I'm just an interested citizen.
You're an interested citizen, perfect. Yeah. That's a really good question. What I was speaking about was the kind of tendency in critical gerontology that in the U.S. tends to happen in the humanities and aging studies. So there are people who are in social sciences in the U.S. who are critical gerontologists, likewise in Canada. Now, just to kind of clarify that. But in the question, do they ever come together? There are efforts lately to come together, and there was a conference last year in the Netherlands where you had kind of cultural gerontology, critical, and humanities, and they were all at the same conference. And what was interesting was that you had some people went to the different events, but other people kind of stuck to their disciplinary, the segmenting in the conference program. So that is, what that raised for me is that in a way, if you want to do that, you need to have the social and the humanities in the same sessions. Almost you kind of force the interaction. But yes, there are. And we just published an edited collection with groups in the Netherlands in particular, and it's trying to think about some of those issues, critical gerontology, the structural meets the humanistic perspectives, and it includes some of that group are philosophers. So the challenge is that you can be on some of these grants and some of the papers, but you don't always speak the same language. So it does take a little bit more work to try to figure out what do we mean when we use this concept. What do we mean, right? What is the tradition? Like Rachel was saying, what's the methodological tradition that tends to take place? So how do we then work on this interdisciplinary project that's meant to transcend social sciences and humanities? Yeah.
Keep it open-minded.
I think it does, yeah. Chris, did you have a thought on that? I saw you. Okay, it was just a
thought on a lot of things.
Right.
Hi, I'm Charles from the School of Social Work. I was really struck with the mentioning of the social constructiveness of age, and I do research on HIV and aging. And the situation that we're experiencing in Canada and North America is that the construction of old age tends to be around this idea of 50 plus now that we're using to define old age in the context of living with HIV. And it's just interesting to see how, and you're talking about policy, about how that has influenced the constructiveness of the idea of aging in this particular domain of living with HIV, because what happened was in the States, the initial practice of the Centers for Disease Control was to track people up until age 50. Because during the early days of the epidemic, we didn't have the number of people that were living past 50. It was mostly a disease of the young. PHAC has now adopted that sort of 50 plus, and only in 2002 have both of these agencies adopted the practice of now looking at more advanced ages, right, in the context of HIV in terms of their surveillance and their epidemiology. So I just find it very interesting to see how a government decision and how a social policy can influence the constructiveness of age. And I guess my question would be, is how can socio-cultural perspectives help us to untangle that and deconstruct that a bit? Because what we're experiencing on the front lines are people who are coming in with very low functionality at age 45 saying, why aren't I eligible for these HIV and aging related programs?
Exactly. And I find what you're talking about is there's a parallel with what I'm trying to do on homelessness. So what's happening in homelessness is that, yes, you're right, you see in practice that the people who come in for services they're experiencing the impairment or the decline, if you will, 10 to 15 to 20 years earlier than this 65 plus. And so some of those examples, also in disability studies, in examples of chronic disability across the life course, and their technology comes into mind, and kind of life-saving technologies that mean that you have lived longer than you may have in the past, but with a higher level of impairment. So I think how I would answer that is to actually start, that we need to collect data from these sites, from these locations, and look at the contradictions between, for example, HIV/AIDS, homelessness, chronic illness as kind of a subset of people who, across the life course, need care earlier, let's say. And the contradiction against this new success-based model of aging that also starts at 50. So that's where 50 becomes interesting, because you see, you've got 65 and it's now, if you look at retirement, 67 and that sort of, that age is moving up. But some of the conditions and the age-related, you can say that, impairments are happening earlier. I think it's really, there's a lot of work to be done there. The problem is it doesn't always take place within aging and gerontology because there are political, it's difficult to do that kind of work, and there are politics about what I was speaking about before, where about people distancing themselves from someone who's ill, right? And maybe a social-cultural distance from that illness. We don't want to admit that one day that might be, that the problem exists, but one day that might be the reality for someone. And age is constructed in that. But yeah, so it's socially structured, socially structured as well. I think it's a really good example. And somewhere that's difficult to then affect social policy, because social policy is still working by age and not by life course perspective, let's say. Yeah, that's what, I'm really interested in trying to figure this out. If you didn't use age as your classification or as your construct, what would you use? What would that look like, and how could you more appropriately align services? Yeah, I don't think I'm going to come up with any answers anytime soon, but that is what I'm really preoccupied with in all of my research projects, is what is another organizing kind of principle.
You would have to include mental health.
Sorry? Yeah.
You'd have to include mental health, people who need to be continually monitored.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's another really good example. I mean, these are the trajectories across the life course that end up challenging the standard models that exist, right? You're right, mental health is another one. Yeah. So,
Most of
trying
us,
to
yeah.
take, sorry?
It ends up being most of us, if you look at it.
Yeah. No, well, actually, that's a really good point. Who is
it based on?
Who is it based on, and who is it not, right? And what ends up? Who are these healthy, successful, productive people? Yeah, who are they? Yeah, they are that ideal. Yeah. You had a question?
I was just thinking there's an interesting parallel between services based on age chronologically and services for people with autism spectrum disorders based on IQ, which again is a chronological marker. And it's, within the social services in Ontario, at least until quite recently, there was a cutoff point of IQ of about 70. And if you were underneath that, you were more eligible for services. If you were over it, you were really not eligible. In recent years, there's been an attempt to blur that a little bit by talking about level of functioning, but in fact, really it defaults to IQ.
And that's a really good point, is that I think what's coming in to replace this chronology, or in the case of IQ, is function. But function, in a way, just gets entangled in age, right? Or in that kind of classification. So in the case of aging, yes, function's being pushed, but it's still rooted in chronological age. It's difficult to kind of separate out of that. And I'm not sure if it's the same with IQ, but the function is certainly function with age. It's now the intersection of age and illness, or age and impairment. Yeah, it's a really.
So where do policymakers get their demographic? Like what demographic are they using? Because there's obviously multiple demographics for each age group.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a complicated question, because when we're talking even about social policy, we're talking about very different kinds of policies, right? And then we're talking about policies or practices. So in a way, when I'm talking about this, I'm muddling a lot of things together that actually are quite different. So retirement is an example. 65 was invented, right, as an age. once that was invented, that became that structure, and it was seen to structure dependency. So
Right.
it was considered that after that point, you would be dependent, you'd contributed to the life force, you know. You then moved into dependency. So all of that is changing. In healthcare, we have the one example of frailty or in home care and that sort of thing, but we have many others as well. So that there is no, in a sense, there's no real aging policy, if you know what I mean. There are aging guidelines, there are frameworks that say we should be healthy and active, but all of the policies that are talking about aging are about education, or they're about health, or they're about retirement. So there are various kind of pockets of policies that impact people who are older, but they're not designed for people who are older, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a huge challenge, and it's exactly that challenge of if you weren't organizing services or policies around age, what would you do? It's also the problem that the policies exist in these silos, and moving across them is pretty much impossible at the moment, and that's what you think about. And I don't necessarily mean as a person, although that's difficult, I mean conceptually, trying to track that through. Actually, one of the research projects I'm trying to figure out right now is exactly that, but as you can see, I'm just not formulated enough yet.
It turns in on itself.
Yeah. Any other questions? Are we exhausted? Great discussion, thank you. I appreciate your comments and